Okay, let's get started. So far, we've run through two of the four pieces of macroeconomics, through growth economics and depression economics. There are two big pieces left, inflation economics and government budget economics, debt and deficit economics. Today, we get to start on inflation economics. Have a nice vacation. Have a nice week away. Problem Set 7 will be out tomorrow via the internet and will be due on March 31st at 11 a.m. here in lecture. And we're going to be working now toward midterm 2, which means that we're going to be trying to pick up some of the threads of growth economics in addition to adding inflation economics, because we moved growth economics off of the first midterm and onto the second. So I hope you all remember this question that is going to be on the second midterm so that you will be able to answer it correctly. About how much bigger is total world GDP now than it was 10,000 years ago? And once again, these numbers are essentially guesses. There are enormous measurement problems and even thinking about how one might calculate the change in global real GDP over 10,000 years, or what such a thing might mean. And yes, we're at 92% still remember it. Good. 17,000 is the thing to have in your mind for this. Human populations are now, I'm going to have to stop saying they're 6 billion and start saying they're 7 billion. Human populations are 7 billion, about 1,200 times bigger than they were 10,000 years ago. And as best as we can figure out, average standards of material standards of living are something like 14 times as high. Doesn't mean we're 14 times happier, but still we're producing on a world scale a lot more stuff than we were back 10,000 years ago per capita. And we're doing so even though, and here's another number I should change. I used to say even though 2 billion people live lives that are not significantly distinguishable from those of our pre-industrial subsistence agriculture ancestors, I now have to lower that to 1.5 billion. People still around the world lead lives that are not significantly distinguishable from those of our pre-industrial subsistence agriculture ancestors. The other thing I want you to be sure to remember, and I'm sure to put on the exam, although this number will actually be different come the second exam on April 7th than it is right now, because we're going to get another employment report out on April 1st, I believe, on Friday, April 1st. I think that's the release date. I think they don't delay it to the 8th. But what is the current unemployment rate that we got? And yes, the current unemployment rate in the United States is 8.9%. That's seasonally adjusted. Actually, 9.5% of those interviewed by the Bureau of Labor Statistics in the second week of February said that of those who said they were either at work or actively looking for work, of those who said they were in the labor force, fully 9.5 said that they were looking for work and had no job percent. But the Bureau of Labor Statistics calculates that for the March unemployment release, unemployment is on average 0.6 percentage points higher than in an average month, because February is a slack month. Businesses are still recovering from the Christmas rush. Construction in the Northeast and the Midwest is still at an extraordinary seasonal low, et cetera, et cetera. And one thing to note about the fact that the unemployment rate kissed 10% at the end of 2009, and since then has declined back down to 8.9%. You might think that that's good news. Right? The unemployment rate rose steeply throughout late 2008 and 2009 from its normal level of 5% or so. It crossed 7.5% at the start of 2009. It headed all the way up to 9.5%, slowly advanced to 10%, kissed 10%, and then came back down. The problem is that the unemployment rate has not fallen because the share of American adults with jobs has increased over the past year and a bit. The share of American adults with jobs today at 58.4%. is actually less than the 58.5% of Americans who had jobs seasonally adjusted in late 2009 when the unemployment rate kissed 10%. What's happening? If people aren't getting more jobs, if a greater fraction of people aren't getting jobs, why is it that the unemployment rate's been going down? And the answer is the unemployment rate's been going down because people have been dropping out of the labor force. That a bunch of people who, a year and a bit or so, would say, yes, I'm looking for a job. They say, I've given up. I'm no longer looking for a job. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that they have become completely useless people who spend all days watching, say, reality TV auction shows or playing World of Warcraft 24/7. Most of them are probably doing other things, but most of them are probably doing other things that they value less than having a job and earning the money. And so if you think, as I do, that the employment-to-population ratio is probably a better guide to the health of the labor market and to the extent to which the American economy is working up to its economic potential, we haven't seen any improvement over the past 15-odd months. The labor market's still as bad now as it was back then. Which is, I must say, quite distressing to me, both as a citizen of the world, because the world labor market's much the same as an American, and also as an economist. Because we economists really do believe that markets are very flexible and adaptive institutions that recover to shocks, and that if something goes wrong with the market system, odds are it will fix itself gradually over time. It might well fix itself a lot more slowly than you would wish it to fix itself. You might well want to have the government take all kinds of actions to help fix it, in addition to helping it fix itself. But the idea is that a period of extraordinarily high unemployment, of lots of people who want jobs and could do jobs not having jobs, is going to fix itself, even if not as fast as we would like, through the normal market processes of people who have jobs, finding workers who want jobs, and hiring them. The fact that that hasn't been happening over the past 15 months is quite distressing, and cause perhaps for some rethinking of economic theory. And another thing that I hope you'll have in the front of your minds when the second midterm comes around, this old question that I put up here because I was talking about it to the graduate students yesterday, of why is Jean-Baptiste say original insight? That is that nobody makes anything unless they intend to use it themselves or sell it, and nobody sells anything unless they intend to buy, so that by definition, by metaphysical necessity, total planned sales must be equal to total planned purchases, that there can be no such thing as everyone having plans that add up to a deficiency of aggregate demand. And yes, everyone's still gotten this, because people spend their incomes not just on currently produced goods and services, but on financial assets. And you can have deficient demand for currently produced goods and services and labor if you have excess demand for financial assets, which is what we had in 2008 and 2009. And the last kind of review question I want to ask today through the iClicker is to send you back to our magic equation for the long-run growth model, in which we say that output per worker in an economy is going to be equal to its savings rate divided by the sum of these three terms that are its savings requirements, all raised to this diminishing return power, and then times the efficiency of labor. Suppose that the efficiency of labor is 25,000 per year, et cetera, et cetera. What then is output per worker going to be in this economy? And people are actually answering this a much faster than I thought you would, which is, I think, a good sign, or I hope it's a good sign. Yeah, okay. So in this economy, we're going to have a capital output ratio of 3, savings rate of 21 divided by investment requirements of 7%, and then with a diminishing returns to scale parameter of 1/2. You don't square or take the square root of the capital output ratio when you calculate output per worker. It's just linear in output per worker. So you have 3 times the efficiency of labor, which is $25,000 a year. That'll give you $75,000 a year for output per worker. That's what we're looking for. And just to keep your hands in, just to reassure me that you haven't forgotten everything you learned on, or everything you had studied for last week's exam, once again, the income expenditure model. All 4 components of autonomous spending at adding up to $8 trillion. And, a multiplier that's going to be whatever it is, what's the level of output going to be in this economy with these flows of autonomous spending in it and with these coefficients determining the multiplier. What's going to happen? C's rate, 12%. Or 12 trillion. You have a multiplier of 1.5 by the time you've subtracted off 25% for the net of tax rate, multiplied it by the marginal propensity to consume, and taken account of the fact that if income falls, a bunch of the income shows up in reduced imports. That gives you a multiplier of 1.5. 1.5 times 8 trillion is 12. That seems to be harder than that seems to be significantly easier than the long-run growth calculations, so I'm not sure why you're not doing as well on them. Let's explore more deeply. We sit with our kind of investment savings version of the income expenditure model. This thing that we owe to British economist John Hicks, parceling out the determinants of total spending and of total output and total demand easily into fiscal policy parts and monetary policy parts. And our machine's going totally haywire. Totally haywire. Hopefully, all the people who are saying 1 are wrong, because the right answer for the multiplier for this is 2. And I'm going to actually save this record and go back into it and see if what we're getting isn't a lot of leakage from the people in the Changshan auditorium next door, in which case we should then reach an agreement about who's going to use which frequency with his iClicker device. And then if you have your multiplier of 2, well, what happens in this economy if a bunch of things in the Federal Reserve and financial markets together raise the long-term real risky interest rate by 3 percentage points? With a multiplier of 2 and with these particular parameters, what's going to happen to output Y? And, yep. Okay, and the answer is, with these parameter values, output is going to fall by 1.8 trillion a year. You're going to get investment spending falling by 750 billion, 25 times 3, and you're going to get export spending falling by 150 billion. Those add up to 900 billion fall in autonomous spending, multiply it by a multiplier of 2, and you get a 1.8 trillion fall in real GDP. That's what the impact of something that raises interest rates is going to be on this economy. And let me run over what we did last Tuesday, since we just did it, then finally move on to the main meat of this lecture, that is inflation economics. And here we have the consumer price index for all urban consumers for all items in the United States of America since 1950. And the thing to notice, first thing to notice, is that it's 10 times as high as it was in 1950. That over the past 2 generations, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, if you had $1 in 1950, you could have bought about 10 times as much stuff with it as you can with $1 today. That the purchasing power of $1 has dropped by about 90 cents. It's simply worth a tenth of what it was 60 years ago. And you can argue over whether this is the right measure or not. There are lots of things that we consume and that we like to consume and that we spend our time doing that are, to a first approximation, absolutely free, that we have available now that we didn't have in 1950. In 1950, the number of people who could watch television was in the hundreds, as opposed to America now, which may, over the next few years, exceed 1 television per person, which would be a remarkable accomplishment. We're already much more than 1 screen per person, but exceeding 1 television per person would be quite remarkable. All kinds of things that people used to pay a huge amount of money for in the 19th century or even in 1950 are available to us for close to free through either broadcast media or the internet. That you might say that in 1950 it was considered a really big deal to have a high-fidelity radio in your house. Back in 1890, you had a New England kind of utopian, Edward Bellamy, writing a book called, what's it called? Edward Bellamy, writing a book, which name I'm blanking on at the moment, one of the 5 best-selling novels of the late 19th century, which is an absolutely execrable novel, this thing he wrote, looking backward. It is the worst novel you can possibly imagine. Complete cardboard characters, no interesting plot, completely unconvincing romantic subplot. He steps out of his authorial role to preach at you all the while. No possible reason for everyone to read it, except a huge number of people in America did, because it excited them about the future, and it looked forward to all the marvels of the future that people living in the 1890s could expect. And of them, the biggest, as his protagonist is transferred forwards the mysterious world of 2100 by an incredible plot device and then wanders around, of them the most extraordinary thing that he learns is that the house he's staying in 2100 has a telephone. And not only a telephone, but a speakerphone. And not only a speakerphone, but you can call up an orchestra that's playing in the city at that moment and put it on the speakerphone so you can listen to music. And not just listen to any music, but there are 4 different orchestras that you could call up. And so you could choose to listen to one of 4 orchestras. And Edward Bellamy's protagonist, that being confronted with this, says that as a result of this, the summit of human felicity has been attained. Which makes me think that he must have had a very low idea of what the summit of human felicity might be, if you can tuning into any one of 4 effective radio stations is one of them. All those changes aren't in the consumer price index, because you can't count them. For the consumer price index, what you can do is you can count by how much have the prices of the things that people bought last year changed between last year and this year, and you can weight those relative price changes by the share of spending last year that went into the various baskets of goods and services that people produced. That's what the consumer price index does. Each year it says how much more expensive than it was last year is our representative basket of goods and services. And as new goods and services are invented, it adds them to the basket gradually over a course of time. They do the best job that they can. Economists believe that the consumer price index, by and large, understates how fast we're growing rich, that it overstates the actual cost of living. We squabble over whether the current overstatement in the consumer price index is something like half a percentage point per year or something larger by 1.5 or 2 percentage points per year. But even if it were 2 percentage points per year, even if over the past 60 years the consumer price index has overstated the rate at which the average price has risen by 2% per year, well, take 0.02, multiply it by 60, and you get 1.2. Take the base of the natural logarithms e and raise it to the 1.2 power, and you have a factor of about 1.5 or so. That means that instead of rising by a factor of 10, the average price in the American economy has risen by about 6 over the past 60 years. This is inflation. And our inflation rate has not been even since 1950. Right here, for example, this 10%, or nearly 10% inflation rate, this is the Korean War. How in 1950, dictator Kim Il-sung of North Korea decides it's time to reunify the country and sends his army south. How first the American army and then a United Nations force intervenes in response. How all of a sudden the United States rearms massively to fight first this hot war and then the Cold War, and you have an enormous surge of government demand for goods that are already in short supply. Prices jump by almost 10% in a year. Then the Korean War ebbs, and the rate of inflation falls back to its kind of more or less normal 1950s, early 1960s level of 1.5 or 2% per year or so. And then it starts to creep up. It creeps up late in Lyndon Johnson and into Richard Nixon's administration. Then in 1969, 1970, the Federal Reserve decides that inflation is too high and that maybe it should raise unemployment, create a little excess supply on the labor market, create a few more workers looking for jobs who say, I know you want paying this guy $8 an hour, but I'll work for $7 an hour. Create a little more excess capacity in the factories so businesses will be a little bit hungrier for business and say, we know that we were going to charge you $20 for this product, but because we have excess capacity and want to sell more, we'll only charge you $19. And so inflation falls, and the Federal Reserve thinks that it's gotten things under control and breathes a sigh of relief. And then the 1973 Arab-Israeli War comes, along with it a global oil embargo from the Middle Eastern oil-producing countries against the United States. The world price of oil triples, and U.S. inflation rises to a peak of 12%. The Federal Reserve hits the economy on the head with a brick again by raising interest rates high. The inflation rate falls back to 5%. The Federal Reserve says the situation is now under control, will return to normal. You have a new normal in the late 1970s, but with an inflation rate now of 6% per year rather than of 2% per year. And so throughout the early Carter administration years, the economists of the Carter administration squabble about what to do with this fact. That inflation, when it was at 1.5 or 2% per year, didn't strike anybody as a problem. At 6% per year, well, every restaurant has to print new menus every 18 months. Everyone has to change their prices all the time. If you have a memory of what something ought to cost, it's no longer reliable. Question of should the government accept that we have an inflation rate of 6% per year now, or should it do anything? Government's still squabbling about that when the Iranian Revolution happens. When the Shah of Iran falls, when the revolutionary moment that follows is seized by the Ayatollah Khomeini, and when the world price of oil again triples for the second time. And inflation in the United States hits a peak of 14%. At which point, newly appointed Federal Reserve Chairman Paul Volcker says enough is enough. Maybe a 6% unemployment rate wasn't something to worry about that much, but a 14% unemployment rate is. And the history of the past 20 years, if it's teaching people everything, it's teaching people that the inflation rate always goes up. We don't want to have a United States that turns out to have a situation in which everyone thinks its money's going to be worthless next year. I need to raise interest rates, and so raise unemployment, and so stop wage and price increases in their tracks until, once again, everyone's convinced that the inflation rate is going to be low and stable. And the next 3 years have what we economists call the Volcker disinflation. As Paul Volcker does indeed raise interest rates, and so hits the economy on the head with a brick, and keeps hitting and hitting, the unemployment rate rises to its post-World War II peak of 10.8%, until Paul Volcker is finally convinced that he's done enough to break the cycle of inflationary expectations, eases off, and then we start our regime since, our post-1984 relatively low inflation regime, in which everyone expects there'll be a little bit of inflation, between 2 and 3% in average years, maybe a bit more in years when something unusual is happening, like Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait that caused another spike in oil prices, until now, when we've had 1 quarter in which consumer prices actually fell. And maybe you can see a downward trend in the inflation rate since the early 1990s, maybe not, but in which the inflation rate is once again relatively low and relatively stable. That's the history of inflation in the United States over the past 60 years. That's what we're going to be talking about between now and the second midterm. And I suppose the first question to ask is, why is this inflation a problem? You know, prices go up, but incomes go up too. Yesterday in the email, I got a link to a post from a Federal Reserve Vice President at the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis, David Andolfato, which someone sent me because he rather uniquely, for a Federal Reserve official or a Federal Reserve staffer or a Federal Reserve affiliate, called Congressman Ron Paul a pinhead. And, you know, since the Congress created the Federal Reserve and oversees it, this is not something you usually see. Federal Reserve Vice Presidents usually say the respected senior member of Congress has some questions which I will strive to answer, rather than the guy will be a real pinhead. But what David is talking about is